I knew something was wrong before I even had my first cup of coffee that morning. It was one of those quiet spring mornings out in Alder Creek Estates, the kind where the air feels clean, the birds are loud, and nothing seems capable of causing trouble. I grabbed my old metal watering can and headed toward the side yard, planning to water a few tomato plants before the sun got too high. Then I stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting over my wellhead was a brand new steel enclosure, shiny enough to catch the morning sunlight, bolted directly into the concrete pad around my pump. Hanging from it was a bright red tag that flapped in the breeze like it was proud of itself. Across the front, in giant block letters, it said, "NON compliant. Do not tamper." For a second I honestly thought somebody was playing a joke on me. Then I saw the HOA logo stamped across the tag. My stomach dropped. That well wasn't some abandoned piece of equipment sitting on community property. It was mine. It had been mine for 15 years. Every permit was in order. Every inspection had been passed. The pump pulled water from my own land, paid for by my own money, maintained by my own hands. Yet somehow, overnight, somebody had shown up and locked it like they owned the place. I walked around the box looking for an explanation, but there wasn't one. Just a heavy padlock and a lot of attitude. The crazy part was that my house wasn't even connected to the subdivision's utilities. Technically, I sat on a grandfathered parcel just outside the municipal water district. That arrangement had existed long before most of the neighborhood was built. Everybody knew it. County officials knew it. Previous HOA boards knew it. Apparently, this new board either didn't know or didn't care. I pulled out my phone and called the HOA office immediately. The manager answered after 3 rings. His name was Randall Pierce, and if you've ever met somebody who could sound friendly while talking down to you, you'd understand exactly what kind of guy he was. "Good morning," he said in that syrupy customer service voice. "How can I help you today?" I skipped the pleasantries. "Why is there a lockbox over my well?" There was a brief pause, then he laughed softly. Not a nervous laugh. Not an apologetic laugh. The kind of laugh somebody gives when they think they're already winning. "Oh yes," he said. "That's part of the community water transition program." "The what?" I asked. "All homes will be joining the community water system by next week. Uniform billing creates fairness throughout the neighborhood." I could feel my jaw tightening. "My property isn't under your water authority." Another pause. Then came the line that changed everything. "If you want to continue living here harmoniously, cooperation would be appreciated." It wasn't a request. It was a threat wearing a necktie. I hung up before I said something I'd regret. The rest of the day, I walked around irritated, trying to convince myself there had to be some misunderstanding. Maybe somebody on the board misunderstood property boundaries. Maybe they got bad legal advice. Maybe there was some paperwork error. But deep down I knew better. Randall's tone told me this wasn't confusion. This was a power play. That evening things got worse. When I opened my front door, an envelope had been shoved underneath it. Inside was an official notice stating that I would be fined daily for maintaining an unauthorized private water source. I actually laughed when I read it because the wording was so ridiculous. Unauthorized according to who? Certainly not the county. Certainly not the state. Yet there it was, complete with a fine schedule and threats of escalating enforcement. The next morning I discovered just how serious they were. I turned on my kitchen faucet and nothing came out. Not a drip. Not a sputter. Nothing. At first I thought maybe the pump had failed. Then I checked the breaker panel. Somebody had shut off the dedicated circuit feeding power to the well equipment. I stood there staring at the panel while anger slowly replaced confusion. It wasn't enough for them to send letters. It wasn't enough for them to put locks on property they didn't own. Now somebody had physically interfered with my utilities. Through the kitchen window, I could see workers installing sections of pipe along the subdivision's main road. Fresh trenches cut across lawns. Orange safety fencing everywhere. The smell of PVC glue drifted through the air. The board was obviously pushing hard to force everyone onto whatever water project they were building. But something felt off. Very off. The harder they pushed, the less confidence they seemed to have. Real authority doesn't usually need intimidation. Real authority doesn't sneak onto private property in the middle of the night. That's when I started asking myself a question that would eventually bring the entire operation crashing down. If they were willing to lock my well and cut power to my pump, what exactly were they trying so hard to hide? Now, before I continue with the story, let me explain something because this is where a lot of people get fooled by HOA boards. Most homeowners assume that if a board member says something with enough confidence, It must be legal. That's exactly what certain boards count on. According to standard procedure, an HOA can only enforce powers that are clearly granted through governing documents, local regulations, and applicable state laws. They don't get to invent authority just because they think something would be more convenient. From a legal perspective, touching privately owned utility equipment is where things become extremely dangerous for an HOA. Once a board starts interfering with property it doesn't own, liability can pile up fast. But there was also something else happening here. This is a psychological trap. People tend to comply when they receive official-looking notices, fines, and threats, even when those threats have no legal foundation. Most folks don't investigate. Most folks don't ask questions. They simply assume the board knows what it's doing. The lesson here is simple. Whenever someone tries to pressure you into surrendering a right, the first question shouldn't be, how much will this cost me? It should be, who gave them that authority in the first place? As it turned out, that single question was about to cause a disaster for the people running Alder Creek Estates. The next morning I drove straight to the county records office, and if you've never spent a day digging through government records, let me tell you, it isn't glamorous. There are no dramatic movie soundtracks, no flashing discoveries every 5 minutes, just dusty files, aging maps, old permits, and a lot of patience. I sat there for hours flipping through property plats, utility easements, infrastructure permits, and development records connected to Alder Creek Estates. At first everything looked normal. The subdivision had permits for roads, drainage systems, and common areas. But when I started looking specifically for the community water system Randall kept bragging about, things got strange. There was no state certification, no licensed public utility registration, no approved community water permit. Nothing. I thought maybe I had missed something, so I asked one of the clerks for help. Together we searched several databases. Same result. The system supposedly serving hundreds of homes didn't officially exist. That's when the pieces started falling into place. I pulled additional construction filings and found references to an agricultural supply line located on property adjacent to the subdivision. The more I traced the paperwork, the uglier the picture became. What the HOA was calling a community water system appeared to be nothing more than a modified connection attached to an agricultural feed line originally intended to supply a commercial nursery several miles away. I remember sitting there staring at the documents thinking, there is no way these people are actually doing this. Either I was completely misunderstanding what I was reading, or somebody had built an entire utility network without proper authorization. I copied every document I could legally obtain and drove home with a folder full of paperwork. That evening I made one phone call. I contacted the State Water Authority hotline and calmly explained everything. The woman who answered sounded professional but skeptical at first, which I couldn't blame her for. She probably received strange complaints every day. Then I started providing permit numbers, property references, and inspection records. Her tone changed quickly. "Can you verify something for me?" she asked. "Did representatives of the HOA physically install equipment on your private well?" "Yes," I replied. "They placed a metal enclosure over the wellhead and secured it with a lock." A few seconds of silence followed. Then she said something I will never forget. "Sir, if that's accurate, we're looking at potential criminal tampering." Suddenly, this wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. This wasn't about neighborhood politics. This was becoming a regulatory investigation. The woman instructed me to email copies of everything I had gathered. I sent the documents that night. Then I waited. For nearly 2 weeks, nothing happened. At least nothing visible. Meanwhile, the HOA continued acting as though it controlled the world. New notices appeared around the neighborhood. Residents received updates praising the benefits of the Community Water Initiative. Randall kept sending violation letters demanding compliance. Every message carried the same arrogant assumption that nobody would challenge them. But behind the scenes, people much higher up were paying attention. 2 weeks later, I woke up to the sound of engines outside. When I stepped onto my porch, I counted 4 white state vehicles entering the subdivision. More arrived behind them. Inspectors climbed out wearing reflective vests and hard hats. Some carried testing equipment. Others carried clipboards and cameras. They spread throughout the neighborhood with the efficiency of people who already knew exactly what they were looking for. Word traveled fast. Within an hour, residents were standing outside watching the activity. Questions started flying. Nobody from the HOA seemed prepared for what was happening. Randall's SUV appeared near the clubhouse. He jumped out looking pale and furious. The HOA president, a retired businessman named Victor Sloan, arrived shortly afterward and immediately began speaking with inspectors. From a distance, I could tell the conversation wasn't going well. Victor pointed repeatedly toward documents he was holding. The inspectors barely looked at them. Instead, they continued taking photographs and collecting samples. By midday, they had traced major portions of the network. Several crews followed buried pipe routes throughout the subdivision. One team focused on an area behind the clubhouse, where landscaping conveniently hid several utility connections. Around 2 o'clock, everything finally exploded. An excavation crew uncovered a junction point hidden behind decorative shrubs. The inspectors gathered around it. More officials arrived. Cameras came out. Photos were taken from every angle. Even from 50 yards away, I could tell they had found something significant. Residents started gathering near the scene. Nobody knew exactly what was happening, but everybody could feel the tension. Then the state officials began issuing orders. Equipment was tagged. Access points were marked. Certain valves were shut down immediately. Within hours, notices appeared throughout the subdivision. Immediate suspension of unlicensed water distribution operations. I watched one resident read the notice 3 times before asking if it was real. It was very real. Panic spread quickly. People wanted answers. Parents wanted to know whether their water had been safe. Homeowners wanted to know why they had been paying utility fees. Others wanted to know who approved the project. The HOA board suddenly found itself facing the same uncomfortable experience it had spent months forcing onto everyone else. Questions. Lots of questions. Victor attempted to address residents near the clubhouse parking lot. It turned into a disaster. He claimed there had been misunderstandings. He blamed contractors. He blamed paperwork delays. He blamed communication issues. The crowd wasn't interested. Every explanation sounded weaker than the last. One homeowner shouted, "Did you even have a permit?" Another demanded to know why private wells were being targeted. Someone else asked whether the board knew the system wasn't licensed. Victor couldn't answer directly. Meanwhile, inspectors continued working. They ordered removal of unauthorized equipment throughout the neighborhood. That included the steel enclosure covering my well. Watching that process felt strangely satisfying. The same bolts that had been installed with so much confidence were removed in less than 10 minutes. A technician pulled the final panel away and stepped aside. For the first time in weeks, my wellhead was visible again. I reset the power, primed the system, and opened a hose valve. Water burst through instantly. Clear, cold, steady. I know it sounds dramatic, but standing there listening to that water run felt like hearing justice itself. Not because I had won some personal argument, but because truth had finally forced its way into daylight. The investigation continued for weeks. Every new development seemed worse than the one before it. Financial records were reviewed. Contractor agreements were examined. Utility charges were audited. Regulatory agencies became involved. Legal notices started arriving. The board members who once acted untouchable suddenly stopped attending community events. Neighbors who had defended them became very quiet. By the end of the month, the consequences were enormous. The HOA faced substantial penalties connected to unauthorized utility operations. Restoration orders were issued. Property owners affected by the illegal installations were compensated. Equipment damaged during enforcement actions had to be repaired or replaced. Insurance carriers became involved. Attorneys appeared. 3 board members resigned before additional findings could be released. As for Randall, the manager who had laughed at me over the phone, he disappeared almost overnight. One day his name was listed on the office directory. The next day it wasn't. Nobody officially explained his departure, but nobody seemed surprised either. The strange thing is that after everything was over, the neighborhood became quieter than I had ever seen it. The same people who once talked endlessly about authority and compliance suddenly discovered the value of staying humble. And every time I walked past my well and saw it operating exactly as it had for 15 years, I was reminded of something important. The people who abuse power often assume nobody will challenge them. What they never seem to understand is that all it takes is one person willing to verify the facts. In the end, they locked my well because they thought it would force me into submission. Instead, that lock became the piece of evidence that brought their entire operation crashing down. Looking back now, the funny thing is that the entire situation started with a padlock. Not a lawsuit. Not a courtroom battle. Not some dramatic confrontation in a board meeting. Just a simple padlock hanging from a steel box that never should have been installed in the first place. At the time, it felt like a personal attack. Maybe it was. Maybe certain people on that board genuinely believed they could pressure me into falling in line. Maybe they were frustrated that one property owner wasn't participating in their grand plan. Maybe they simply enjoyed exercising authority. Whatever their motivation was, they made the same mistake a lot of power-hungry people make. They assumed compliance and agreement were the same thing. They assumed that if they could create enough inconvenience, enough paperwork, enough threats, eventually somebody would surrender. What they never considered was that some people respond to pressure by asking questions. And questions are dangerous when the facts aren't on your side. The lesson here is not that every HOA is corrupt. I've lived in communities with reasonable boards, hardworking volunteers, and people who genuinely wanted to improve their neighborhoods. Most HOA members are regular homeowners trying to solve ordinary problems. But every once in a while, a board forgets where its authority ends. That's where trouble begins. According to standard procedure, organizations operate best when rules apply equally to everyone, including the people making those rules. The moment leadership starts believing it's exempt from oversight, accountability starts disappearing. That's true for HOAs. It's true for businesses. It's true for governments. And it's definitely true for neighborhood power structures. From a legal perspective, one of the biggest mistakes homeowners make is assuming that an official-looking notice automatically means someone has legal authority. It doesn't. A letter is just a letter. A fine is just a piece of paper until it rests on legitimate authority. That doesn't mean people should ignore every notice they receive, but it does mean they should verify claims before surrendering rights. A lot of conflicts become much easier to understand once you separate confidence from actual authority. Those two things are not always the same. Something else stood out to me during this experience. This is a psychological trap that appears everywhere in life. When people are confronted by a confident authority figure, many immediately start questioning themselves. They think, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I should just go along with it. That's exactly what aggressive personalities rely on. They count on self-doubt doing their work for them. The reality is that calm investigation is often more powerful than confrontation. I never won because I yelled louder. I never won because I threatened anyone. I won because documents don't care about opinions. Records don't care about personalities. Facts don't care who sits on a board. The truth eventually speaks for itself if you're patient enough to find it. And honestly, there was another lesson hiding underneath all of this. The board became so focused on controlling one homeowner that they stopped paying attention to the risks they were creating for themselves. That's surprisingly common. People chasing power often become blind to consequences. They start believing success means forcing compliance rather than earning trust. But trust works differently. You can't demand it. You can't find people into giving it to you. You can't lock somebody's property and expect respect in return. Real leadership requires transparency, humility, and accountability. Without those things, authority becomes fragile no matter how powerful it appears on the surface. Today, every time I turn on my faucet and hear clean water flowing through those pipes, I'm reminded that rights are usually lost in small steps, not giant leaps. Most overreach begins with someone testing boundaries to see whether anyone objects. That's why paying attention matters. That's why asking questions matters. That's why understanding the rules matters. The lesson here is simple. If someone claims authority over your property, your money, or your rights, don't panic, don't assume, and don't automatically comply. Verify, investigate, learn the facts. You might discover the situation is exactly what it appears to be, or you might discover something much bigger hiding underneath. So now I'm curious. Have you ever dealt with an HOA, neighborhood board, property manager, or local official who tried to push authority further than they legally could? How did it end? Did they back down when challenged, or did things escalate even further? Share your experience in the comments because some of the wildest HOA stories I've ever heard came from ordinary homeowners who simply refused to accept because we said so as a valid answer. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe because sometimes the most satisfying justice doesn't happen in a courtroom. It happens when the people abusing power finally discover that somebody took the time to read the paperwork.